Hi folks, are we back?
Yeah, back.
All right. Now that we've spoken about the models that are at hand, we will be now talking about some attribution mistakes that we can make. And specifically, I'm just taking an example of the diamond model that we have. So when we have the diamond model that we were talking about, just to reiterate, we use the adversary, capability, victim, and infrastructure 4 points of analysis that we use. And in this, there is a heavy over reliance on infrastructure centric analysis that we do. So, where or what kind of infrastructure or where are the adversaries details hosted? Where are they attacking us from? The second aspect that we use is the capability centric analysis, which basically again focuses on how much basically the adversary and the capabilities of what they're trying to use is looking at. And then we use the victim centric analysis as well, which basically focuses on who does the adversary want to attack. Now, in this, we have some biases that basically come up in each of these four analyses that we look at. So firstly, I'm going to be looking at the adversary analysis that we talk about and starting, sorry, with infrastructure centric analysis. So the first thing that we generally make as a mistake is around researching where the adversary is actually coming in from, what kind of details they're actually sending, right? So with these kind of things, when we look at a specific adversary and we try to find out the details from where they're attacking us, what IP addresses are they using, which country are they coming up from, there is a generic notion that is set for each adversary. For example, there are some notions which are set like US is a big market for attacks, like China is a big market for attacks, so and so. So people, what they generally do is whenever they see any of these IP addresses coming up, they generally think of them to be attacks. Now, why do these come up and why are the notions built? Because generally we do see a lot of attacks coming up from these regions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the information that you have or that you have researched upon is correct. So what we actually do here is, because there are so many open source or rather free services that people are using, right? In terms of domains which are free, in terms of IP addresses that are free, in terms of cloud hostings that are free, etc. as well, a lot of the attackers have started circumventing country based attacks by using CNAMEs and domain names. Now, when I say that they're using domain names, etc., what they're actually doing is that they're circumventing a lot of these information that they're getting in terms of hiding their IP addresses. And when they're hiding their IP addresses and using domain names, those domain names can be actually registered anywhere. It doesn't have to be a specific place. It doesn't have to be one specific area. But at my own free will, I can change what is actually hosted behind these host names or these domain names, and I can actually start routing them from everywhere or anywhere that I want. Now, as a person, when I'm analyzing these domains, when I start building notions in terms of understanding where these details are coming up from, they start to lead to problems. And what kind of problems is that? We start making certain assumptions in terms of how the attack is structured. Okay, maybe this domain name is free, so hence somebody or the other is trying to misuse it. The second kind is around sinkholes. How many of you know what sinkholes are and don't know what sinkholes are?
Not aware of it.
Okay. So sinkholes is basically when you have a specific IP address resolving to multiple domains, right? Now, what generally happens is that, for example, if you take say AWS as a Route 53 source, right? Or if you even take Ultra DNS to be a DNS provider. Now, what generally happens is one common IP can actually replicate itself across multiple domain representations because there are multiple customers behind that. Now, when one of those domains actually start misbehaving, it actually starts leading to a cyclic attack or leading to a cyclic notion built up that all the other domains that we are actually on that IP address are also malicious. Now, the second notion that we build up with sinkholes is around the fact that when a single IP address is also resolved into multiple domains, it can mean that one of those domains is malicious. But when you start categorizing them in terms of, say, IP to domain mapping or figuring out where that IP address is coming up from, it can actually misrepresent a lot of data. So when we're specifically looking at infrastructure, when we're specifically looking at IP addresses that an attacker is using or an adversary is using, we have to be sure that the IP address in itself is not a sinkhole because number one, it is the easiest way to hide your IP address and figure out how I can classify my domain name to be still positive in nature, but also spread malicious content from there. The second thing that you need to be careful of is how many DNS IPs or host names is it actually resolving to. So when you resolve, say, one IP address to multiple domain names, you actually do not know how to figure out which one is actually good, bad, because when you start doing a reverse lookup as well, you will start finding out that the IP address still remains the same. You still find out that the names that are getting resolved are still the same. So just basis of the IP address and DNS names that we get, it can still lead to problems. And why does this happen is because of us having multiple dynamic DNSs enabled. And attackers generally do this in a very specific way in terms of hiding their attack. The third aspect, and I'm sure most of us has done this, is around Whois that we've actually used. Anybody not familiar with Whois?
I think we are aware.
Okay, perfect. Now, what domain resellers actually do is that they look up domains which belong to certain industries and certain companies, and whenever they do expire, they try to take control of those domains, right? Now, when I am a attacker and if I want legitimate domains to basically start serving malicious content, this is a very easy way of finding that out and also abusing it. The second thing that people do is that they basically look at adding a lot of information in terms of their email IDs or their command and control domains itself in the Whois information. So there are certain attackers which have used this path before as well, which says that they have basically used email IDs or even their DNS names in their Whois information. Now, how this helps is whenever their say their one domain is compromised, what they actually do is they just update their Whois records and source the DNS name from the Whois records itself. So by that form, if anybody is trying to attack you as well, they will keep updating that. Once you start mitigating them and blocking those domains, they will keep updating them at the back end without you even coming to know or how that is actually happening as well. So again, trusting information sort of becomes difficult in this scenario as well. And then obviously it is the egress space that we're looking at. 10 years before, we had a lot of static IP addresses, people hosting out of say data centers, people having one IP address to a service. that format has now changed because of cloud, because of CDNs coming in, because of multiple front hops coming into your structure, which basically now says that your IP address keeps changing. Now, where we look at IP addresses to be a part of mitigation, it becomes extremely difficult in terms of blocking out IP addresses because number one, getting an IP address is become fairly easy. You can change it, hop it, you can do whatever you want. It's at a click of a button now. And secondly, because of delivery services that we have, that one domain name itself can route to say 100 IPs, 500 IPs, 1000 IPs. So how much will you actually block? So even when we said, okay, we will actually go down to say IP addresses, we will go down to say CIDRs, etc. as well. Now that starts becoming a problem because at the end of the day, you can't just take a simple call by saying, okay, if I'm using a content delivery network like say Akamai, etc., and Akamai is actually infecting me, or a customer who's on Akamai is actually trying to infect me, you can't block off their entire CIDR ranges. Similar with Cloudflare, similar with CloudFront, right? So there are multiple things to do where IP addresses has now started becoming a little redundant in the terms of how we used to scope out CDI information. Although it is still used, I'm not saying it's not used, but again, it is becoming far less relevant in today's day and age. How many of you have used VirusTotal or any other inspection solution where you've put in a domain or a file to find out if it's malicious or not?
Yes, I've done it.
Yeah, I
Okay. The biggest problem about VT and all these services is that they basically use a JavaScript on the front end to capture timestamps from uh, the attacker or the uploader's machine itself. For example, if your timestamps are set to something, it basically uses the front end JS to basically capture the timestamp and store that. Now, the problem here, or say the good part for attackers here, is that they can basically manipulate that JS to change the timestamp to whatever they want. So for example, if you have submitted VT data to a lot of solutioning that you have available, you can very easily change the timestamps that are there. You can change the dates. You can change, say, any form of file that has been uploaded there. You can change that to something recent or something old as well. Now, what that does is it basically decreases the confidence that we can actually pick up information from these sources as well, because for one file, the entire date range goes wrong. For example, if there was a malicious file that came up in Feb 2020, right? Now, if I'm trying to use the same file, I can still upload it and give a timestamp of say December 2019 as well. I can similarly give a timestamp of Jan 21 as well. How this how this confuses CDI is you do not know the exact start date or end date for any kind of attack that is actually coming up. There are ways of circumventing this, and BT has been working on this essentially to capture upload timestamps of when you're actually uploading the files. But again, that again leads to problem because the in the APIs that they have, you can again manipulate timestamps. So whenever we are sourcing this information about say IP addresses or host names or whatever details, etc., that we capture for the infrastructure, there are certain known aspects by the way of design that we cannot start trusting them blindly. So next time when you punch in an IP address onto VirusTotal or any of your open source feeds and you see, okay, this is malicious for so and so time and all, do not trust it blindly. That's all I will say. Again, do your homework in terms of that being a domain which is malicious or being rebought, or check their egress status, check their dynamic DNS status. After all these things is when we can start interpreting this data correctly. Okay, the last part is around name servers and registrars. So what people have also started doing is that they have started mimicking certain activities For example, there was a domain which was malicious earlier, right? What people started doing is they started mimicking activities for those domains which basically were malicious earlier and have now started leading to problems coming up. So if I was a user who had a attack field vector and I had used a domain name, say carbon2u.com, people have started pointing to the same domain by re-registering them. And what people start doing is they think, okay, this activity is something which we have seen earlier and will probably use the same attack vectors. Because at the end of the day, you had already recognized an attack from that surface before. But people are aware of this, attackers are aware of this, and they started doing circumventing around these things as well. Or to confuse people, they started using the same domain names but to launch different kind of attacks. So again, have to be a little careful, cannot blindly rely on this information. Now you might say, okay, I don't care about this information. At the end of the day, the researcher or say whoever I've subscribed to is giving me this feed. But yes, they are doing it, but I'm just trying to show you where things can go wrong as well. So that's why not to even blindly trust information, because at the end of the day, all this is happening via some analyst who's sitting and reading this information. Now, what level of information or what depth of information they've gone down to is a question. I don't know how many of you will agree or not agree with me on the last part, which basically says scans are not attacks. Uh, People probe your site consistently for multiple reasons. Uh, how many of you think that scans are all attacks?
I think scans can lead to attacks, maybe something like that.
Okay, so what is your general incident response in terms of in your company? Uh, who basically, what do you say? If you're receiving a scan in your company, what is your generic incident response that you see?
Uh,
Just give me 1 second. Sorry, just apologies. 1 second. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, I was saying that in terms of scan, I don't think that in my company we are looking at the IR response, but yes, we are actually tracking it through threat hunting, like creating a series of commands which do the recon, famous for recon, and we usually look at we run it on weekly or 15 days, and we just check from where the scan is coming, and those basic triaging we just do it. But right now, I don't think that we have IR in place for scanning.
Okay, perfect. So generally, whenever I talk to people, they just think reconnaissance or say scans that are happening on your site are generically attacks. And the first thing what people do is have thresholds, and from thresholds they start blocking aspects. Now, what this does is it pollutes the CTI space a lot. And what I mean by that is if you start marking an IP address malicious, it starts flowing into other customers. Other customers start blocking that when these scans start attacking them or say scanning their interface. At the end of the day, maybe that was nothing, but that IP address or that domain that you were seeing basically gets polluted because of the information and the IR that we have. So a lot of people when they say okay, so and so kind of scan is happening or so and so kind of recon is happening on my site to block that IP address, and they do it as a consistent thing, you will start seeing that IP address popping up in CTI very very soon, because generally all this information from your vendors etc does flow to CTI, does flow to open source feeds as well. And in general what happens is domain names and IP addresses again start showing up as malicious. And you can try this out. Take an IP address, scan any website, just hold that IP address for some time if you can. and run a scan again after say 6 7 days, and then just go check your IP reputation, say on Virus Total or IBM Expose after say like 2 weeks, you will start seeing that IP getting flagged, because there are multiple ways that people have started, polluting CTI information as well by being over responsive. So yes, block them when they are actually, launching attacks, but for recon, it doesn't make sense. And that's why when we rely on this infrastructure centric analysis that we're looking at, that okay, I have so and so information about the adversary, I can actually be misled into multiple ways of analyzing things and looking at them. It's not just static information that I look at, but even say domains, even say sinkholes, doing a whois, and these are like standard IR processes I've seen across multiple industries where people are generally following this practice where uh, they are calculating who is information, they're calculating IP reputation, they're calculating multiple details in terms of who the registrar was, how soon was the domain registered, who does it belong to, right? And basis of this, people start taking information and start inferring details out it, right? Now, what happens out of this is that it starts leading to problems for generic CTI folks as well. Again, I'm not saying it's not the right approach. What I'm trying to say is that over reliance on this data starts to become a problem, and it's not like people do not know you are looking at it. Okay. All right. The next thing that we're going to look at is overestimating uniqueness. And this is also a generic problem that we tie up to capabilities. And the problem here is, again, like I said, for a specific adversary, their capabilities generally do not change too much. There are certain things that we can look at. There are certain things that they do obviously change a little bit. But if you start overestimating their aspects in terms of how much effort they're going to put in to manipulate a specific kind of attack, it starts leading to issues again. And let's discuss why. In simple terms, if you look at multiple people doing the same thing, or if you look at multiple people picking up, say, a same kind of information and then churning that around in the sense that, okay, if one person is doing it, that's fine. If you say a score of say 10, 20, 30 doing it, it's a problem, right? Now, when people know these kind of things happen, what they generally tend to do is they tend to sacrifice a certain aspect of their capability. For example, if I am an attack group and if I want to look at, say, attacking my victim, what I would end up doing is I would say, okay, this is what I want information to get published, and they would start doing it, right? And where this comes in from is specifically malware. And in malware kind of analysis, generally what happens is people pick that information up, put it on VT, people pick that info, or vendors pick that information up, send it for sandboxing. Some people reverse engineer these malwares. They give out certain aspects of how people are getting targeted, right? Now, for this, what is happening is basically people are generally not seeing the left and the right of how these things are happening. So what I mean by that is people are focusing on just looking at, okay, so and so group had a capability of exploiting so and so malware, or this malware does XYZ on your system, and that is about it. People don't look at how this actually entered, right? What is the entire supply chain that we're seeing? Nobody looks at that. So that tends to start becoming a problem. And then every time something changes around, right? If you compare, say, APT 28 to 29, if you compare APT 11 to 12, they're the same attack groups, they're the same adversaries who have done it. But if you look at the details of their changes, it is very, very minuscule to start evading techniques. The second thing that looks at problems is that people generally pick up So like you also, if you have to build something up, right, you will not start building from scratch. You either use a framework, you either use something that somebody's already built before. Now, even in the attack world, when people want to use an exploit or something like that, one person writes that exploit, multiple people use it, right? Some people tailor that exploit to a little bit to benefit them or to feed their kind of attack more. But the problem here is that people do not estimate that these builders, whatever they doing in the first place, are going to be doing something very different. So again, in terms of capabilities, if we have the basics correct, if we say that, okay, this is the way that somebody can build a malware, or this is the way somebody can build an APT, and this is the way that they will actually be using to get inside my system, those things don't change, right? Again, if they even change, the tools that you have are very, very adequate, and they can basically help you create a different version of the same malware or same malicious file in seconds. So if today you are blocking something on your infrastructure and saying, okay, I have capability to detect so and so kind of thing, those things can change in seconds. And what this possibly does is that uh, people have started doing reverse communications as well, where they can change CNC servers. So you block one, they can change it. You block the other one, they can change it, right? And they're getting driven by multiple UIs. They're getting driven by multiple aspects where people are building web pages to just control their malicious servers or their malware, etc., that they're putting in. So these things do change, but if they're changing that frequently, it doesn't mean that the capability itself has changed too much, right? Again, like I said, if you go back to the pyramid of pain, it basically you have to focus on what can change very frequently and what cannot change. So if you're seeing, IP addresses changing, hash values changing, all that, yes, they will definitely change. But that does not mean that people have reinvented the complete wheel in terms of devising a new capability. The next thing that we look at is exploits. So in terms of exploits, sorry, in terms of exploits, uh, there are multiple ways that these exploits are again being spread, right? And how they are actually being used. So when somebody is analyzing, say, one CB, they're analyzing another 0 day which is coming up, right? And what their goal was and what they're actually trying to do, right? Uh, the same kind of exploit will have multiple ways of or say have multiple kits that they're using. They will have multiple ways that they've been constructed, right? And again, the operators also keep changing. So when we look at ways that people are trying to look at exploits which are happening, uh, people use the shared codes, people use shared generators as well, and the person who's actually designed this exploit, right, will be successful in a specific way. But when those same things start being shared across the industry, those capabilities again start becoming very minimalistic, because changes, yes, can happen. People can take exploit kits, people can use the same thing in a different way, but again, capability wise, they do not change too much. Sorry. Yeah. The next thing is around build environments. I don't know how many of you have looked at metadata or files. Has somebody looked into metadata?
Yes, file type, file extensions, yes.
Yeah. Okay. For those of you who are not familiar, every file has certain metadata to it. That metadata gives out a lot of information, right? You can modify a lot of information. Say if you use Windows, you can modify creation time, edit time, blah, 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 using multiple solutions. But the original metadata of the file does not get changed, and you can actually pick out all this information from there. Now, using this, we can find out multiple build environments that people use in order to build certain malware or spread it around. And again, like I said, these things again don't change too much. So although files will change, hashes will change, everything else starts changing. But if you start looking at more granular, lower level information that we look at, things don't change that frequently. And this metadata is something which is heavily overlooked in the industry by saying, okay, this is a complete new file which has come up, so I need to analyze this again. I'll have to reverse engineer it again. But if we just go down one level further, you will figure out that things don't change that frequently. And again, in this scenario, the capability will not change. So detection mechanisms, etc., will still work. Uh, your reverse engineering will not be required. So you save a lot of time over there. The third one that we're going to look at is around victim centric analysis. And this specifically talks about who is going to get attacked, right? Is it me? Is it an industry? Is it someone else? In this, the number one information that we generally bias upon is around the telemetry. There are certain aspects or certain industries or certain victims who are targeted much more frequently than anybody else. Now, what generally happens in this scenario is if you see, say, the gaming industry getting targeted, or if you see, say, e-com getting targeted, you generally start forming biases about the telemetry information that we receive. And what I mean about the telemetry information is that this sourced from Taiwan or this sourced from China, and they had a CNC in say Russia and blah blah blah, right? People have built up these misconceptions in their head that malicious traffic can come out of these 5 countries or 6 countries, and that is where it's coming up from. And because it's coming up from there, it has to be, say, a government-driven attack. Say tomorrow, if an attack happened from China on India, you will say, "Oh my God, it's state-sponsored, it's government-sponsored, blah blah blah," which all is incorrect because these are all biases that we have, right? And we need to get down to the actual source of the information to confirm all this. The next thing that we need to look at is that correlation does not equal to causation, right? So what you look at is that there are certain cyber espionages that keep happening. You must have read recently about Ukraine and all that stuff that was also happening from Russia, etc. Now, a lot of people generally start looking at generating a lot of fake activity before these kind of attacks happen, right? And when you have something already drilled into your head, when you say, okay, because there is already a war going on, there is already some problems that are happening, you start tailor making data in terms of understanding how that incident was happening. So in general, there was an increase in traffic, which you said, okay, happened at so and so time frame. That then led to an attack. So then we said, okay, this has to come out from, say, Russia. This has to be, this traffic that you're also seeing is malicious traffic that is coming up. It might just mean that you have generic users who are increasing on your site because of XYZ reasons, right? So whenever you're actually analyzing victims, specifically to countries, specifically to government sponsored attacks, specifically to industries, we need to look at them individually. We need to start taking out all the information in terms of, is there any external factor, and is there a country associated to it which you have a bias against, etc., right? So all that information needs to start plugging out. There are also some biases again that we fill up about hackers around China and Vietnam, and Vietnam and China and US and all that stuff that we keep looking at. So again, we have to look at specific cases. Again, it might mean or misuse representation in terms of there were some attackers who took down a site, put up somebody else's name and started using that. At the end of the day, what happened is that people formed a bias that, okay, again, so and so kind of thing, because China and Vietnam are at war and all that stuff. This happened by so and so people, but actually the attackers were completely different in terms of what they had done. They used somebody else's name over there, and because that causation was there, so people started believing it as well. Another point that we look at is anchoring, and anchoring is something which is fairly, I think everybody must have dealt with it sometime or the other, is around somebody targeting a specific industry or a specific hold of people, and you getting affected by it as well. So in general, what happens is whenever some attacker wants to is doing a very focused attack, right, on say an organization or say an industry, they will start polluting a lot of the other competition as well. And why they do that is just because to understand or to diversify a little bit, that people get occupied in understanding what kind of attacks that they're doing, and they will start heading into a different direction by saying, okay, so and so industry is getting targeted, or say my competition is also getting targeted, even we're getting targeted. But it might just mean that the attacker will be, or sorry, the victim will be someone completely different, right? And this is generally done whenever sponsored attacks happen and whenever targeted attacks happen. Okay. Uh, yeah. The last part is around adversaries, which we say are anchoring biases again. In anchoring biases, uh, I don't know how many of you remember about fruit fly, right? But even in fruit fly, what had happened was uh, there was an entire data breach that had happened, etc. Right? People or the FBI Flash had also sent out a lot of information in terms of fruit fly happening, and that information was misrepresented because it started talking about multiple secondary targets, but actually the primary target was somebody completely different. And this happened, in front of everybody as well. This was published in a DEFCON talk as well. So if you're more interested in it, you can look at it. Just it's called Tasking OSX with fruitfly.b. So you can look at it in how capabilities are exposed for certain traps that people set up when they're talking about adversaries. Okay. Uh, the next thing is around mirroring images, which is basically you must have dealt with all of this as well, where we say, okay, uh, North Korea is a problem, and their neighbors, they're fighting and all that stuff. So you'll constantly see people trying to malign each other image, and they'll constantly see that these IP addresses which are coming up from are talking about certain adversaries which might or might not be the same people, and this is all around evasion to try and find out or pin the blame on somebody else. I don't know how many of you were aware of the Swift transaction fraud that would also happen, which Park Jin Hyuk had done. So this was also completely different. There's also a UN chatter to say that there was it was somebody completely different altogether who they've caught. But let's see. Okay. Any questions so far? Folks, any questions?
I think this was trying to digest too much of information.
All right. Okay. Okay, to summarize, uh, basically we need to analyze and acknowledge the limitations of data, right? We need to acknowledge that there's some pre-existing ideas about every adversary, their capabilities, their victim and infrastructure, and we need to figure out how we can remove analytical biases when we are going through CTI information and picking out the best information in terms of meaningful information which people have not just written because they feel it, but actually supported with evidence, right? And that kind of information you cannot go wrong with. So whenever you're also looking at some say CDI information which you pick out in terms of IP addresses, domains, host names, la 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 la, all that stuff, just make sure that we keep churning out the right information. We have enough evidence to prove whatever we're saying, and we look beyond one specific direction and we look and we research properly. Because again, you will get so much data, you will get a lot of information. Everybody will tailor make that information according to what they feel. We need to sort that out and look at it correctly. Cool. Folks, any questions on this part? All right, okay.
Yeah.
So just to understand, I mean, how we're going to go about the labs now is, how many of you have Ubuntu installed in your systems or as a VM or something?
So it's a VM on Ubuntu.
Yeah, that's okay. But and what version are you running?
I think this is 20.
Okay, perfect. Does everybody also have the same versions running, or is there something, I mean, or does somebody not have it at all?
I don't have.
Okay,
I have it 21.
right. Those three people. Anybody else who has or doesn't have Ubuntu?
Yeah, I don't have Ubuntu.
Okay, right. So that's three. Anybody else, folks? I'm just trying to take a number because then I will start setting up some machines and giving it to you people. Uh, any other numbers that we have?
So I think till now too, I and Ranjit have Ubuntu on the machine.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about everybody else because I'm not getting any response, but okay. All right, so I'll set up about 4 to 5 machines then and give it to everybody else. For people who do have it, can use the same machines that they have. In case those don't work, I'll set up some machines and give them to you. Just give me 1 second. Let's see. Okay, so what we're going to be doing, I'm just going to be sharing my screen. Yeah, so there is a open source solution called TRAM, and what we do with TRAM is basically TRAM helps us to take any threat intelligence report and map that to the attack framework, right? How this helps is, if there are any reports which are written very arbitrarily, etc. as well, or if you don't feel like going through any threat intel report and manually mapping it down to defense evasion techniques, etc., or the TTPs that we talk about, TRAM basically you can just feed that report to TRAM and it will basically map it out for you in terms of all the attack frameworks that we have. So any report that you receive from your vendors, etc., if you want to convert it into your attack methodology, you can use the solution for it. It runs on a Docker container. So if those of you who don't have Ubuntu, do you guys have Docker on your system or you don't?
I'll install it. I mean, I don't have it. Install it.
So for those of you who do have Docker or don't have Docker and have Ubuntu, you can do it on the Ubuntu. I mean, I'll walk you through the Ubuntu setup as well. For those of you who don't have Ubuntu, if you can install Docker on your machines, then basically that's all that we require. We just need to basically pull a Docker container and run it. Uh, if you have none, that's also okay. I'll set up some machines and give it to you. So I'm just sharing this link with all of you, and For those of you who are using Ubuntu and want to install Docker, this is basically what we're going to be following. To get the solution up and running. So folks, just take a 10-15 minute break. I'm just going to run a CloudFormation script to basically start deploying 5 to 6 machines, and I'll share the credentials with you. So just take a 10-15 minute break and let me just get that up and running.
Is that a link which you have given? Okay, got it.
I've shared it in the chat. So in TRAM, basically it has a prerequisite for Docker and Docker Compose to be up. So those two things is something we'll install before, and after that we'll install the TRAM solution. So it's basically just Dockable after that. So cool, folks. Just give me time till about 12:35. Let me just run the CFT, and I'll get back to you on machine set.
Okay.
Do you guys have your AWS Academy accounts from Reva or no?
No, we have. Actually, we got Azure
Okay, you
Academy.
guys, do you guys have credits left there or no?
Not sure. It should be there.
All right, okay, doesn't matter. Just give me some time. I'm just setting it up. Just give me 10 minutes. I'm just writing a script. Hopefully it will be done by lunch and then we can use it. Just give me 10 minutes to just write that out.
Yeah.
All right, folks, are we here?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. I've run the CFT. It should probably do it in some time. Hopefully, post lunch, we should have the machines ready. So, till then, we'll just cover some other aspects. All right. Now that we've spoken a lot about, say, the models, we've spoken about some biases, etc., what can go wrong with the models in terms of data, etc., as well. There are some things that we should be discussing in terms of how we can look at this data and how we can apply certain techniques that were applied, say, for tactics in World War II to apply also in CTI. Uh, these analyses basically help us in modeling data correctly and how we can actually look at the entire aspect as well. To start off with, there is a doctrine which is basically called the Kent's analytic doctrine, which basically says that this model, I mean, whatever model that we build for CTI, right? According to the doctrine, it says that we should be doing a more structured analysis, right? And this model and this doctrine has been basically taught a lot for intelligence analysts by US, etc., for multiple years, etc., that we have. And slowly we see this also moving into the cyber intelligence space as well, since this has been like a baseline to analyze and understand what CTI information can do. So what this says and what we basically need to do is not to reinvent the wheel. People have been dealing with dramatic amount of information for a very long time, right? And cyber threat intelligence being a new discipline, right? It's not very different from how analysis was done a long time back. And using those analysis and where things did go wrong, etc., we can actually use the same lessons that we actually learned at that point of time in cyber threat intelligence as well. So what the doctrine itself says is it's a 9-step process. And what it does is the first concern it says is focus on policymaker concerns. Instead of voicing all of them out, I'll discuss them one by one first. So just come, yeah. So what basically happens is we have to realize that every organization is actually funded by some decision maker, and that decision maker controls the budget, right? And so many times in cybersecurity as well, we find it extremely difficult to get budgets for solutions and also to understand how they can make a very positive impact on the company itself. So for years and years, till very recently, even like till say 3 to 4 years back, cybersecurity wasn't getting its focus and wasn't getting its budgets as well because people thought that it's a drawback and it's basically just a burden on budgets that we used to basically talk about. And very recently, all companies started realizing in the digital era that we're going and moving towards that it becomes fairly important to start protecting your infrastructure, your information, and your customers, right? Uh, that being said, we have to look at what people are actually, or who those people who control those budgets and people who are making those decisions are actually understanding what the exact problem is, right? And for them to understand what cybersecurity and what cyber threat intelligence does, right, uh, is very difficult because to provide value in cybersecurity very nascently and to say that okay, this is the ROI I'm getting out of the this much money that I'm spending is very difficult, right? And generally that is why we see a lot of fallouts in terms of cybersecurity budgeting happening by saying okay, although people did get budgets, but when they were asked in terms of how it was helping and what what their budgets were actually doing, it actually became very difficult for them to justify it. So what we basically need to do is asking these policymakers as to what is important for them. And if customer image or customer protection, brand image, and a secure experience that we're talking about to our customers actually matters to them, then proving this amount becomes fairly easy. But if we're always going to think of it as a drain, and in terms of zero ROI coming in and actually nothing happened in this year, then it starts becoming a problem. So we need to basically circumvent and come back to asking feedback on how we're reporting things, right? We need to come back and say, okay, how can we actually make this product more valuable to you? How can you start marketing it to your customers so that it starts benefiting the business? And start looking at multiple drivers that you have. So is security a only concern, or is it actually something which we can use positively to drive customers towards us? You use certain websites, you don't use certain websites is because of your trust in those websites that you build, and how we can make that trust better is something that the doctrine actually talks about. The second aspect is around avoidance of a personal policy agenda. And simple thing is to leave your agenda out of reporting. And I've been saying this repeatedly that there are multiple biases that we talk about. There are multiple things that we think about, right? Uh, the best way that we can do or avoid this is to basically leave out all the agendas that we talk about in terms of country, threat actor, infra, whatever we can talk about, right? Now, uh, there are times when people find this extremely hard, especially in the recent times with the Ukraine and Russian war as well. You will see a lot of reports which immediately direct them to Russia or immediately direct them to Ukraine or immediately direct them to China as well. So uh, when we are going through these reports, and if we seeing that it's specifically talking about threat actors coming out from specific regions fueled by something else, we need to avoid that at all costs. We need to discuss, we need to avoid discussing these things without putting them into our report. And this is generally for people who will be writing CTI reports, right? The best way to figure this out is to ask somebody who is unbiased to read your reports and assess whether whatever you want to call out from your report is actually being called out without adding a personal agenda there. The third aspect is around intellectual rigor. So CTI reports, like I said, is extremely analyst based, and we always rely on these analysts to fill in the gaps, to fill in missing information, to figure out the unknown that we don't know about, right? Now, problem here is that if you give the same report to 10 people, everybody comes up with different kind of aspects and different kind of reports that actually do not make sense. So what this actually comes up to say is that in terms of consistency, if you ask the analysts 10 times again to go through the same report, they will give you different and they will give you different results. And this is generally not a problem in, say, just cyber threat intelligence, but also in the data science field, where we say that looking at information again and again and repeatedly tends to change the view and the consistency that we have. And many times, analysts who basically work in many organizations, they are so many times told things that you are making things up because they don't have enough evidence to support it, right? Now, whatever I feel, whatever you feel doesn't make a difference. Whenever we write reports, it needs to have certain credibility in terms of data with it, supporting it, and also following some kind of structure and analytical techniques that we use, uh, calling out clearly what models you're using. And if you're taking some information from people who have already worked on these kind of things, to give them credit as well. The fourth part talks about a conscious effort to avoid analytical bias. And what this basically says, our CTI reports are full of analytical biases, right? And Many CTI analysts today are not trained in analytical biases. Hence, people even without knowing it tend to add it in their reports. So many things that what languages etc and even some tests etc do is that they have an analysis and argumentation kind of section that they talk about, and generally the idea is to train people in fixing analytical biases and logic fallacies, and you can call them out also when you're actually reading them. And the second aspect is reviewing your reports which you publish. So identify all the work where you think that you have added an analytical bias in the structure, or somewhere where you said it, okay, this information I might have said without conforming to any data that we've actually gone through. So that actually starts making more and more sense in terms of people believing your reports. Why do people go to say FireEye, or why do people go to say other companies where and trust their reports? Is because they have a lot of data to back them up. And if I just write a report by saying, okay, I feel so and so is happening, or I feel this is happening and that is happening, nobody's going to read it and nobody's going to trust it. Sorry. The fifth aspect is around willingness to consider others' judgments. Uh, I know all of this sounds very theoretical, but again, when you're reading these reports, if you keep these things in mind, it will obviously start tinkering with your mind a little bit to say, okay, maybe I need to improve this, or maybe I can come up with a judgment a little later on by understanding whether this report is actually talking about data or not. So hence I'm going through these things, and it becomes important even when you're analyzing these reports or using them or writing them, right? So the fifth aspect talks about willingness to consider other judgments, and this basically says that I am not always right, and people need to figure out that just because I say anything and that is the buy all and end all of it, right? Uh, People would have faced this with managers in their industry as well, where people have given a sort of like a dictatum to say that okay, this is the correct way and this the other ways are not right. Doesn't work in CTI. When people give you feedback, when people tell you that okay, so and so thing I feel is bringing in some bias as well, go back to your report, read it, try understanding if you have enough data to support whatever point you're making, and it actually can support whatever you're writing. The sixth aspect is around systematic use of outside experts. So again, you cannot be an expert in everything, and even if you are extremely good at CTI, if you probably would need somebody externally, or somebody who's better than you, or has an augmented mind in terms of discussing the technical topics. So in case I am an expert at something in my industry, it doesn't mean that I cannot take help from somebody in the similar industry, or if I'm writing about a different point, I take their opinion about it. You cannot know everything, especially when you're working in an organization which is large, which is fairly distinct, has multiple products to serve to your customers, etc. Right? So idea here is we charter on team wins, and we look at having outside experts coming in talking about certain issues as well. And best thing that works over here is that you network and you have experts on your call, that you can basically just pick up the phone and say that okay, this is the problem I'm facing, and what are your insights in this, and what can you probably help me out with. Idea is you listen to everybody, uh, take their inputs. Maybe they might be right about something, maybe they might not be right about something, but always take their information so that you can back up your own claims, and you have enough evidences also, and also enough names also there to refer and impact whatever you're talking about. The seventh part is around collective responsibility for judgment. And this is where you, if as a team, disagree on something, do it behind closed doors. But if a report is getting published, if you already sent it out in the market, don't call out somebody by saying that, okay, I told so and so person to not do it and I felt so and so way. Once a report is published, no matter what happens, you have to stand by it as a team. You can't say that, okay, this is not something which I agreed upon and so and so person, stood their way and got it done, etc. and all that. You have to be responsible for what you're writing. Tomorrow, if a company is publishing a report, you can't go back and say that tomorrow, this so and so kind of report was actually written by so and so team and they didn't actually refer to me and all that stuff. It is a report that you're publishing. If it's wrong, it's wrong. If it's right, it's right. You have to be playing up as a team whenever you're writing CTI reports. The eighth part is around effective communication of judgments. So whatever you analyze, right? Uh, if you can't make your audience understand it, it actually doesn't make any sense then. So whatever you are writing, whatever you are putting in a summary, whatever you are writing in or presenting to your board, etc., if you have illustrations, if you have data, then just putting in words, uh, it'll make much more sense. When you're writing these reports, you might be very technical sound, but understand your audience, understand what they understand in terms of wordings, etc. as well. And don't use any technical terms which people might not be able to refer to. And always get a review done by your audience. So somebody who doesn't have an idea about it, or if you're targeting a specific audience, to get it reviewed by them. And always use some decision points, etc., that you can from key decision makers. uh, Let them analyze your reports, etc., as well, so that you can bring the best effect there. The ninth part is candid admission of mistakes, and there are multiple ways that people who are analyzing things can make mistakes. And in most cases, if information is missing, or in if you did bring out something which actually wasn't true, or you didn't have enough data to claim it, you can just simply claim that it's wrong. It doesn't make you small, but you have to like just take it in. You have to correct your mistakes and move on. We can't keep supporting a claim if we know is wrong or is incorrect by just adding or more fuel to the fire there. So these are the nine things that basically Ken's doctrine of success talks about. And coming back to this is that all these points generally are very, I would say, make sense in a nature where you can use these pointers not only for CTI but even otherwise. But idea here is whenever you're reading or writing any reports that you're doing, to keep these 9 points in your mind so that you have a very clear cut way of putting your points through and across to everybody. Again, we spoke about models and we spoke about frameworks, and just wanted to bring out why they matter is because they offer you a lot of repeatability, in the sense that every time you analyze something and you're using a model, you will reach to the same conclusion. Your conclusions will be consistent, right? If you have metrics, if you're adhering to those models and those metrics, your data will be clearly represented and your credibility of your team goes up. If you tell people that I have used so and so model to analyze this aspect of the report and this is how I published a report, it brings out a lot more value than saying that I have done this in an ad hoc way which I have not understood, right? So that's why it's important to follow these models and to also apply them, because CTI in itself has a huge credibility problem. And this is why I'm sure that even when you've gone to multiple open source fields and all, and you've realized that, okay, one feed says something, the other says something, one report says something, the other says something, is because people have not discussed reports enough. They've not used enough models to come to a perception, but just build that up in their head and publish it, right? The damage here is that an organization can be using that report and taking a distinct call in terms of say blocking a region or taking a country down altogether about that. So there are multiple aspects that we need to take care of, especially with CTI. Any questions so far? Folks, any questions?
No, I think.
Okay. So highlighting the top most four of them, coming to understanding how they can help us, is basically avoidance of personal policy agenda, rigor. If we consider others' judgments, we take collective responsibility for the judgments, and having effective communication, right? If you remember these 5 pointers, your reports will not go wrong. You will be able to bring out the meaningful value in them as well. And moving to some case studies, right? Uh, the case study number one is on use of outside experts. Can somebody please just read this off and just read it for everybody, please?
Yeah. Bletchley Park mistakenly recruited Jeffrey Tandy, thinking he was an crypto programmist, a code breaker, when in fact he was a crypto gamist. Okay. A botanist who studies plant without seeds. Okay. So it's a true case study?
Yes, it is. Go ahead, I mean, just continue reading it.
Yeah. When Batchley recovered a waterlogged codebook, the codebreaker believed it was a total loss. Okay. Tandy knew better since dying out organic material is a core crypto gamist. Okay. So I'll read to the text one. This success starts with a mistake, but without Tandy being in the right place already, this would have been a missed opportunity. Okay.
What we're trying to
The,
bring out here is, even though this started out with as a mistake, and whatever was called out here, I mean, everybody thought that okay, we've like really messed up, but it really turned out to be a blessing in disguise, and that's why using your outside experts on fields that even you know best might help to give you a different perception altogether in terms of understanding certain aspects of CTI. So don't be afraid of bringing this in. Don't be afraid of asking for help whenever you are stuck or you do need to get an objective view about something. Okay. Can somebody read this one, please?
yeah, somebody else here. I mean, go ahead.
I'm just hearing two voices today on call. Is like, are other people here or?
Yeah, man, go ahead.
Okay, so admission of mistakes. When the US entered the war in 1942, the British Navy already understood the importance of using convoys to protect ships. They even had good data on how convoys protected shipping assets. Fleet Admiral MS King believed the British Navy was obsolete and incompetent and decided not to follow their advice on the use of convoys. Some also attribute this to a lack of escort ships in the Atlantic fleet. King eventually reversed course, admitted the shortcoming, and used escort ships to protect the convoys.
Yeah. So, sorry, my bad. Thanks, Kamal. So basically, what happens here is that ideally, whenever we have made a mistake in CDI, either using it or writing it, the sooner we call it out, the less damage we make, right? There have been certain instances, even in terms of CDI reports, which have come up, which have misspelled threat actors or adversaries and then have churned them around. But if we don't do that, then we just bring up a wrong notion in terms of aspects that we're learning and we're not looking at. So whenever we are reading or writing any of these reports, it's fairly I mean, less damage to anything, that we can just accept it and move on from there, and correct the mistake that we made. Okay. Uh, can somebody else read the third one? Wow. Okay.
On this, I can do it.
Yeah.
Analytic biases. WW2 engineers studied the aircraft returning from battle to see where they were being hit and adjusted to add armor to those locations. The thought process was that the locations where the planes were observed being hit were the most likely to be struck by anti-aircraft fire. The statistician Abraham Wald recognized an important survivorship bias that was present in the data, noting that planes which suffered fatal hits never returned and as such were not part of the analysis. Conclusion: the wrong parts of the aircraft were receiving extra armor. Okay.
Thanks. So basically, what this says is that if we study the wrong data and if we start putting in biases wherever we feel, the end result is not going to help us, right? So that's why it's very important to get this bias out. And we do keep talking about this in theoretical terms, but understand from a perspective that even if I give you or everybody a report right now, and if I ask you to write your own conclusions without discussing it, I will get almost 5 to 6 versions of the same thing. And why that happens is because it's generic human tendency to pick out information and to write certain information and to process certain information which we feel is more important, which some other person will find more important when they're reading it. And in this, CTI starts becoming a little less credible because even if you're discussing something with your peer, and if you don't use certain models and frameworks to understand that, it basically starts leading to a lot of judgments, which then starts becoming a problem for everybody. So do remember, we need to kick the analytical bias out. We need to focus on data. We need to look at if we're studying the entire data and back up whatever we're talking about with data as well. All right. Anybody from the other two who read can read this? I believe we have other people on call as well, right?
Sure, I can go. The German generals believed the Russians would only commit their Western forces to defense. The tank were superior to anything the Russians could produce. Hitler is widely thought to have believed these and he removed generals who didn't agree and his narratives. Telling leader what they want to hear so you can be favored is clearly advancing their personal policy agenda and your personal policy agenda too.
So ideally, what we want to bring out here is we need to focus on what's best for everybody. We have to also look at removing anything that we want to bring out. It might mean that we have claimed something and we want to, prove everything according to that, but it doesn't mean that that's true, and it's far from the truth. So the idea is that whenever you are writing or reading CTI reports, right, we need to make sure that we're keeping our policy agenda out, whatever it may be. It again, if you stick to data, if you stick to your frameworks, if you stick to your models, you will not be facing these issues. Cool. Any questions that we have on this?
No, Dhruv, I'm good.
Perfect. All right, folks. So you guys can break for lunch. We'll catch up at around 2:15, and then take it forward. I'm just going to be checking the status for the machines as well, and hopefully they're up and running by then.
Dhruv, you shared that link, right? I see that there are some commands to install Docker on
Yes.
Ubuntu.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
so
ideally, all that we require to do is just install Docker and uh, pull the tram Docker container and start it. That's all we need to do.
okay, I'm just trying to run those commands on the Ubuntu machine.
Sure. Cool, folks. I'll see you 2:15 then.
Sure.
See you.
Thank you.